Frank was exhausted. It had been a long day at the bank, with meetings that seemed to drag on forever and clients who demanded more than they gave. All he wanted now was to go home, pour himself a stiff drink, and forget the world existed. As he drove through the dimly lit streets of Abuja, the tension in his shoulders began to ease, but not by much. The night had a way of closing in, making everything feel smaller, tighter, suffocating. As he turned onto the street at Woozy Zone 2, a place known for its late-night transactions, Frank's eyes caught sight of a group of women standing under the neon lights. They laughed and chatted amongst themselves, their smiles inviting, their eyes sharp and calculating. He hadn't intended to stop, but something in him, a deep, restless need, made him slow down. Just for a moment, he told himself, just to take his mind off things. Among them, one stood out, a woman of striking beauty, with long flowing hair and eyes that seemed to pierce through the night. Her name was Linda. She was everything a man could want in the heat of the moment, alluring, mysterious, and above all willing to make him forget his troubles. Frank didn't think twice. He rolled down his window, exchanged a few words with her, and soon she was in his car, a faint knowing smile playing on her lips. The drive to his house was short, filled with the kind of small talk that neither cared to remember. They arrived at his place, and before long they were in his bed, tangled in each other's arms. For a while, Frank felt the weight of the day lift off him, replaced by a sense of blissful surrender. Afterward, with his body spent and his mind at ease, he drifted off to sleep, not knowing that this was exactly what Linda had been waiting for. The moment his breathing deepened and his body went still, Linda slowly slipped out of bed. The room was dark, but she moved with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. She began to murmur softly under her breath, the words of an ancient, forbidden language. Her voice grew louder, more insistent, as she chanted the voodoo incantations, summoning others from the depths of the night. One by one, they appeared, more of the marine spirits, each one more terrifying and beautiful than the last. They encircled the bed, their eyes gleaming with dark intent, their voices low and melodic as they joined in Linda's chant. Together, they wove a spell around Frank, making his sleep so deep that not even the loudest noise could wake him. As he lay there, his body unmoving, they worked their magic. With a final, chilling chant, they invoked his spirit, pulling it from his body. His spirit hovered in the room for a brief moment, confused and terrified, before it was sucked into a small toy doll that Linda held in her hand. The spirits laughed softly, pleased with their work. They knew that when Frank woke, he would remember none of this. It would seem to him like a strange, distant dream, the kind that fades the moment your eyes open. But the truth was far more horrifying. His spirit was now trapped, bound to the doll, and there was no escape. With their task complete, the spirits faded away one by one, leaving Linda alone in the room. The next morning, Frank awoke to the scent of something delicious wafting through the house. Still groggy, he stumbled out of bed, expecting to find a quiet, empty home, but instead, there was Linda. Humming softly as she moved about the kitchen, she had prepared the most amazing breakfast he had ever seen. Perfectly scrambled eggs, golden brown pancakes, fresh fruit, and freshly brewed coffee that filled the air with its rich aroma. "Good morning," she greeted him with a smile that seemed too perfect, too radiant. Frank couldn't help but feel a sense of warmth, a strange comfort in her presence, as though she belonged there. After the exhaustion of the previous day, this felt like a dream, a sweet reprieve from his hectic life. "Make yourself at home, Linda," he said after taking a bite of the breakfast, his words almost automatic. "I'd love for you to stay another day." She smiled that enigmatic smile again, nodding as if she had expected this. Frank got ready for work, feeling an odd sense of contentment that lingered from the night before. Linda's presence had dulled the stress and fatigue, and as he drove to work, he found himself already thinking of coming back to her, of seeing that smile again. But as soon as Frank arrived at the bank, the day took a dark turn. His boss, a man who had always valued Frank's dedication and work ethic, summoned him to the office. There was something off in the way his boss looked at him, a coldness that Frank had never seen before. "Frank, I'm sorry, but I have to let you go," his boss said, his voice devoid of emotion. Frank blinked in disbelief. What? Why? Is there something I did wrong? The boss simply shook his head. It's nothing personal, just a decision we had to make. We're downsizing. Frank stood there, stunned, as his boss went back to his paperwork as if nothing had happened. It made no sense. He had always been a top performer, respected by his colleagues, yet here he was, being dismissed. The shock on his face was mirrored by his co-workers, who could only offer him sympathetic looks as he gathered his things and left the office. Devastated, Frank drove home, his mind a storm of confusion and disbelief. When he walked through the door, Linda was there, her presence a beacon in his turmoil. He poured out his frustration, recounting the bizarre and unfair way he had been fired. "It doesn't make any sense," he said, his voice breaking. "I've given everything to that job, and they just threw me out like I'm nothing." Linda listened, her expression soft and understanding. "I'm so sorry, Frank," she said, her voice soothing. "You don't deserve this, but maybe it's a sign that you need a break, something to help you unwind. Here, I have something that might help." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small packet of white powder, cocaine. Frank hesitated, looking at it with uncertainty. He had never touched drugs before, always priding himself on staying clean, but the pain of the day, the overwhelming sense of loss and confusion, made him consider it. "Just to take the edge off," Linda urged gently, her eyes glinting with that familiar, eerie light. Against his better judgment, Frank nodded and took the packet. It was a slippery slope, one line to ease his pain, and soon he found himself reaching for more. Each hit brought a fleeting sense of relief, a brief escape from the turmoil that had become his life. But with each line, he also slid further into a dark abyss, where the shadows of despair grew larger and more oppressive. From that moment, bad things began to happen to Frank. It started subtly at first, as though the universe was toying with him. His beloved dog, a loyal companion for years, fell ill suddenly and died in his arms. Frank was devastated, but before he could even process the loss, more tragedy struck. His mother, his rock and source of unconditional love, passed away unexpectedly. The grief was overwhelming, but even in the throes of mourning, life seemed determined to strip away everything he held dear. His fiancée, the woman he had planned to spend his life with, could no longer bear the man he had become. She returned his engagement ring with tears in her eyes, whispering apologies that couldn't mask the disgust and disappointment in her voice. "I can't do this anymore, Frank. You're not the man I fell in love with," she said before walking out of his life for good. Frank was left alone, his heart a hollow shell. The losses piled up, crushing him under their weight. With no job to sustain him, his savings drained to nothing, and his only solace came from the cocaine Linda always seemed to have on hand. But that solace was a double-edged sword, slicing away at his soul with every indulgence. Desperation drove him to sell his possessions one by one. First, it was the little things, a watch, a piece of furniture, anything to get the next fix. But soon he was selling the very walls around him, his car, his precious belongings that once symbolized a life of success and stability. It was all disappearing, swallowed by the black hole that had become his existence. In less than 3 months after meeting Linda, Frank had become a shadow of his former self. The confident, well-to-do banker who had once had his life figured out was now a jobless, hollow-eyed addict. His landlord, who had once greeted him with a smile, now pounded on his door, threatening to evict him for unpaid rent. Frank, who had once been on the verge of a new life with a wife and a future filled with promise, now faced the cold reality of a life in shambles with no clear path to redemption. Each night, Frank lay in bed, tears streaming down his face as he succumbed to the crushing weight of his despair. Sleep offered no solace, for his dreams had become a twisted reflection of his waking nightmare. He would find himself in a strange water world surrounded by beautiful women with otherworldly eyes. They would call to him, their voices sweet and seductive, promising him peace, escape, and pleasures beyond his imagination. "Come home, Frank," they would whisper, their hands outstretched. "Come to us, and you'll never have to suffer again." In the dream, their words filled him with an aching desire, a longing to give in and let go of the pain that had become his constant companion. But when he woke, he was left with nothing but the echoes of their promises and the cold reality of his crumbling life. One night, the pull of those dreams became too strong to resist. The voices had grown louder, more insistent, weaving their way into his mind until he could no longer distinguish them from his own thoughts. They promised him release, peace, and a final escape from the misery that had consumed him. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Frank found himself driving to the bridge that spanned the Atlantic Ocean. The night was eerily quiet, the city's usual hum of activity strangely absent, as if the world itself had paused to watch what he was about to do. He parked his car on the side of the road, the wind tugging at his clothes as he walked to the edge of the bridge. The ocean below was dark and endless, its waves crashing against the rocks with a relentless force that mirrored the chaos inside him. The voices in his head grew louder, urging him forward, their promises of peace filling his heart with a desperate hope. "Come to us, Frank. You'll never have to feel pain again. You'll be free." With tears streaming down his face, Frank climbed over the railing, his grip tight as he balanced on the edge. For a moment he hesitated, looking out at the vast expanse of water below. But the voices didn't let up, their allure too powerful to resist. In that final moment, Frank let go. He plunged into the cold, unforgiving depths of the ocean, the water swallowing him whole. As he sank into the darkness, the voices faded, replaced by an eerie silence. As Frank sank into the darkness, the voices that had once guided him to his watery grave faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The cold water wrapped around him like a cocoon, and for the first time in months, Frank felt a strange sense of calm. It was as if the ocean itself was cradling him, easing him into what he believed would be an eternal sleep. But beneath the surface, something far more powerful was at work. Something that Frank could not have anticipated. Unknown to Frank, his fiancée Rose had been spiraling into her own abyss of despair after returning his engagement ring. The man she loved had become a stranger, consumed by addiction and darkness, and the pain of losing him had nearly broken her. But Rose wasn't alone. Her best friend Phil, a woman of unwavering faith, had taken her in, offering her a shoulder to cry on, and something more, a path to healing. Phil could see the toll Frank's downfall had taken on Rose, and she knew that only something stronger than the forces at play could save him. She encouraged Rose to pray, to fight the darkness that had claimed Frank, not with anger or sorrow, but with the power of faith. Together, they spent countless nights in earnest prayer, asking for divine intervention, for a miracle to save Frank from the grip of evil. The weight of their prayers seemed to fill the room, a palpable force that Rose could almost touch. And then, on one of those nights, something extraordinary happened. As Rose knelt beside her bed, her hands clasped tightly, tears streaming down her face, she felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The room grew still, as if time itself had paused. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sensed a presence, a holy presence, filling the space around her. She kept her eyes closed, and in the quiet of her mind, a vision began to unfold. It was Frank. She saw him as clearly as if he were standing right in front of her, but he wasn't the man she remembered. His face was drawn and gaunt, his eyes hollow and lifeless. He was standing at the edge of a bridge, his expression one of utter despair. And beside him she saw Linda, no longer human, but a grotesque, otherworldly creature, her eyes glowing with malevolent triumph. Around them, dark shadows swirled, spirits of the deep, waiting eagerly for Frank to take the final step into oblivion. Rose's breath caught in her throat. The vision shifted, showing her the events that had led Frank to this moment. The encounter with Linda, the gradual unraveling of his life, and the dark forces that had preyed on his vulnerability, driving him to the brink of suicide. It was as if a curtain had been pulled back, revealing the true, sinister nature of the world Frank had been drawn into. And then the vision changed. She saw herself racing against time, desperately trying to reach Frank before it was too late. But the forces of darkness were powerful, and they weren't going to let him go without a fight. Rose felt a surge of urgency. She had to act now, or Frank would be lost forever. The vision faded, leaving Rose trembling, her heart heavy with both fear and determination. She knew what she had to do. Without a second thought, she grabbed her keys and rushed out the door. The echo of the vision still fresh in her mind. The night was quiet, but her spirit was ablaze with the knowledge of the battle she was about to face. But as Rose reached her brand new car, ready to speed to Frank's rescue, she found herself facing another obstacle. The engine, which had always started without issue, suddenly refused to turn over. She tried again and again, but the car remained stubbornly silent, as if it were under some dark spell. Rose's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the seconds slipping away, each one bringing Frank closer to his end. The frustration and fear threatened to overwhelm her, but she quickly remembered the source of her strength. With all the faith she could muster, Rose placed her hands on the dashboard and began to pray fervently. "God, please, don't let them stop me. In the name of Jesus, I command this car to start." For a moment, nothing happened. But then, as if responding to the authority in her voice, the car's engine roared to life. Rose felt a surge of relief and hope. She had no time to waste. With a whispered prayer of thanks, she put the car in gear and sped out of her driveway, the tires screeching as she raced toward Frank's apartment. As she drove, her eyes scanned the road, searching for any sign of Frank. She tried calling him, but there was no answer. Her mind raced with thoughts of where he could be, but the image from the vision remained burned into her consciousness. She knew she was running out of time. Suddenly, she spotted a car pulling out of Frank's driveway. Her heart skipped a beat. It was him. But something was wrong. Frank's driving was erratic, as if he were in a trance, oblivious to the world around him. Rose honked her horn, rolled down her window, and shouted his name, but he didn't respond. He was too far gone, lost in the darkness that had claimed him. She pressed the gas pedal to the floor, determined not to lose him. But Frank's car sped ahead, weaving through traffic with a dangerous disregard for his surroundings. Rose's knuckles turned white as she gripped the steering wheel, her prayers growing louder with each passing second. "God, please guide me. Don't let me lose him." For a few agonizing moments, she lost sight of him. Panic gripped her heart, but she refused to give in. She knew the battle wasn't just on the road, it was in the spiritual realm as well. Her prayers became more fervent, more desperate, as she called on the Spirit of God to lead her to Frank. And then, just as she was about to despair, a thought came to her, unbidden but clear. The bridge. The same bridge from her vision. Her heart pounded as she realized where he was headed. She turned the wheel sharply, heading in the direction of the bridge that spanned the vast dark waters of the Atlantic Ocean. As she approached the bridge, her headlights cut through the darkness, and there, illuminated in the dim glow, was Frank's car, abandoned at the side of the road. Her breath caught in her throat as she spotted him, standing at the edge, staring down into the churning abyss below. "No, Frank!" Rose cried out as she slammed on the brakes, barely registering the sound of tires screeching against the pavement. She threw the car into park and flung open the door, but before she could even take a step toward him, Frank jumped. The world seemed to slow as Rose watched him plunge into the icy darkness below, her heart screaming in silent agony. But she wasn't the kind of woman to let fear or despair paralyze her. Years of training and unyielding determination had taught her to act under pressure. And so, without a moment's hesitation, Rose sprinted to the edge of the bridge and dove in after him. The cold shock of the water was nothing compared to the terror that gripped her heart. Rose's body cut through the waves with precision. She was an Olympic gold medalist in swimming, and her instincts kicked in as she swam furiously towards the spot where Frank had disappeared. The ocean fought her, its currents pulling at her, trying to drag her down into its depths. But Rose refused to yield. Her mind was singularly focused on one thing: saving Frank. As she dove deeper, her hands frantically searching, she caught sight of him, a dark silhouette sinking lifelessly toward the ocean floor. With a powerful kick, Rose propelled herself toward him, grabbing his arm and pulling him close. He was unconscious, his face pale, his body cold, but Rose wasn't ready to give up on him. She wrapped one arm around his chest and began the arduous swim back to the surface, her lungs burning, but her determination unwavering. When they finally broke through the surface, Rose gasped for air, the icy wind cutting through her wet clothes. She could feel Frank's limp body in her arms, and the reality of how close she was to losing him fueled her efforts. Desperately, she pulled him to the shore, her muscles screaming in protest as she dragged him onto the sand. Rose immediately began CPR, her training taking over. She pumped his chest with all the strength she could muster, her breath steady and controlled as she tried to force air into his lungs. But Frank wasn't responding. His body lay still, his lips tinged blue, his eyes closed as if already resigned to death. "No, Frank, don't do this, don't leave me," Rose cried out, her voice breaking as tears mingled with the seawater on her face. She wasn't just pumping his chest, she was praying, pleading with God to bring him back, to give them another chance. She pressed down on his chest again and again, her breaths coming in ragged gasps as she tried to breathe life back into him. But nothing. Frank was gone. The crushing weight of it all hit her like a tidal wave. For a moment, Rose faltered, her hands trembling as she stared down at Frank's lifeless form. All the pain, the fear, the loss. It was too much. She felt like she was drowning in it, just as Frank had drowned in the ocean. But then something stirred within her. A spark of the faith that had brought her this far. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. She could feel it deep in her soul. This was a battle, and she wasn't going to lose. Not now, not when she had fought so hard to get him back. "Come back, Frank, please, come back," she whispered through her tears as she resumed compressions. "God, I know you can save him. Please, don't let him go." As Rose continued to fight for Frank's life, something extraordinary began to happen. Deep in the abyss, where Frank's spirit had been drawn, he was surrounded by the marine spirits who had once lured him with their beauty. But now, as they closed in on him, their true forms began to emerge, twisted, grotesque creatures, their once beguiling faces now nightmarish and horrifying. Their laughter, which had once seemed sweet, was now a cacophony of cruel, mocking jeers. Frank's eyes widened in terror as he realized the true nature of the beings that had ensnared him. The horror of it all flooded back into his mind, and he began to struggle against them, fighting with all his might to escape the clutches of the marine spirits. The darkness that had seemed so comforting was now suffocating, and the promises of unending pleasure had turned to ash. And then, amidst the chaos, Frank felt something else. A pull, faint but persistent, drawing him away from the darkness. He could hear Rose's voice, faint but clear, calling to him, pleading with him to come back. It was like a lifeline, cutting through the despair, and Frank clung to it with everything he had. As he fought to free himself from the marine spirits, Frank's chest tightened, his body convulsing as if something deep within him was fighting to break free. And then, with a sudden violent gasp, he coughed, water spilling from his lungs as his body jerked back to life. Rose's heart leapt in her chest as Frank's eyes fluttered open, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. For a moment, he looked around in confusion, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. But then his eyes locked onto Rose's, and in that instant he knew. She had saved him. Tears of relief and gratitude flooded Rose's eyes as she watched the color return to Frank's cheeks. She cradled his face in her hands, her voice trembling with emotion. "Frank, you're alive. You're okay. You're here with me." Frank's hand weakly reached up to touch hers, the warmth of her skin grounding him in the reality that he had been pulled back from the brink of death. I saw them, Rose," Frank whispered, his voice hoarse. "They were monsters. But you saved me." Rose shook her head, her tears falling freely now. "No, Frank, it wasn't me. It was God. It was his power that brought you back." Frank nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. After their harrowing experience at the bridge, Rose immediately took Frank to the hospital. He was weak and shaken, but alive. The doctors examined him, but found nothing physically wrong. A miracle, they said, considering what he had been through. But Rose knew that Frank's true healing required more than just physical care. As Frank rested, Rose made a call to her pastor, a man of deep faith who had guided her through many trials. Within an hour, he arrived at the hospital, carrying with him the spiritual authority needed to confront the darkness that had ensnared Frank. Rose and Frank sat in the small, dimly lit hospital room, holding hands as the pastor began to pray. The atmosphere in the room grew thick, almost tangible, as the pastor called upon the power of God. His voice was firm, unwavering, as he commanded the forces of darkness to release their hold on Frank. As he prayed, Frank felt an intense pressure building within him, as if something was resisting the pastor's words. He closed his eyes, feeling the struggle within his very soul. And then, as the pastor's prayers reached a crescendo, Frank's eyes flew open. A searing pain shot through his chest, and he gasped, clutching at his heart. The doll, he could feel it, the connection it held to his spirit, binding him to the marine world. The pastor sensed it too and directed his prayers towards breaking that connection, calling Frank's spirit back from the dark clutches where it had been trapped. Suddenly, a strange warmth filled the room. Rose looked around, sensing that something was about to happen. The air grew hotter, and then, without warning, a burst of light erupted from the corner of the room. The doll, the same one that had been hidden away, now sat on the bedside table, glowing with an unnatural heat. Frank and Rose watched in awe as flames began to lick at the edges of the doll, consuming it in a blaze of fire. The flames roared to life, but they didn't spread beyond the doll, as if an invisible barrier contained them. The room was filled with the crackling sound of burning wood and fabric, yet no smoke or heat reached them. It was as if the fire was otherworldly, meant solely to destroy the object that had bound Frank. The doll burned with an intensity that seemed to defy reality, and within moments it was reduced to ashes. As the last embers flickered out, Frank felt a sudden release, as if a heavy chain had been broken. He gasped, his spirit free at last from the grasp of the marine world. The room, which had been so tense with spiritual battle, now felt light and peaceful. The pastor smiled, his face reflecting the calm that had settled over the room. "It is done," he said quietly. "The hold they had on you is broken. You are free, Frank." Tears filled Frank's eyes as he turned to Rose, his heart overflowing with gratitude and love. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything, for betraying your trust, for falling into their trap. I don't deserve your forgiveness." Rose shook her head, tears glistening in her own eyes. "You were deceived, Frank, but you fought your way back. We fought together, and I forgive you, because I love you." They embraced, the weight of the past months lifting as they held each other. In that moment, they knew that their love had been tested in the most brutal way possible, and yet it had endured. It had been refined in the fire, and now it was stronger than ever. When Frank was discharged from the hospital, life began to take on a new rhythm. He was offered his old job back at the bank, a job he had once been proud of, a symbol of his success. But Frank had changed. The brush with death and the spiritual battle had shifted his priorities. The things that once mattered to him seemed trivial now in the face of the purpose he had found. "I appreciate the offer," Frank said when he met with his former boss, "but I've been called to a different path. There's something more important that I need to do." And so, with Rose by his side, Frank turned down the job, and together they began a new journey. A ministry dedicated to exposing the dark secrets of the marine world and the strategies they use to ensnare souls. Their mission was clear: to bring light into the darkest places, to free others who were trapped as Frank had been, and to show that no matter how deep the darkness, the power of God's love and light could reach and redeem.